Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our year-end close seminar today. And we have tons of information for you. And, our goal is to take this process and make it as simple and straightforward for you as it can be. So it can be, I know it can seem overwhelming. There's a lot of information out there and a lot of steps, everything. So we're going to go through it today and make it a lot clearer for you and show you links and access to all the information that you might need as you start working through this process and you have additional questions. So before we start, as Amber mentioned, we have an excellent manual available for you, and you can download it here, and there's also a link in our meeting today, so you could download it as well. And just to get kind of a nice preview of it here, this example here. So this is the manual that we have prepared, and it has a wealth of information in here. So you definitely take advantage of this and download this manual. It'll have everything you need as far as the process, and then we have some additional information in here. It's organized where we have overall support information, some tips and just pointers before you get started, and then it's broken out by here. So it'll go through all the details, every section that you need to run the process on. And one thing I just want to point out on here is it also has information for our support department. So if, as you're going through, if you have questions after today, or as you're just going through the process, or you want to schedule time with some help on any of these steps, we have a support department that can help you. So definitely reach out and contact them if needed. All right, back to our here. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to go through, first we have a few items that we want to touch on just related to GP and some overall information that will be helpful for you in preparing. And then we're going to go through the sequence of closing the year in GP, and we'll talk about the different steps that are required for each module. So what we'll do is we'll go through all of the main financial areas first, and then we're going to have a little bit of time for some, if we have any critical questions that have come up related to what we've talked about, we'll have about 10 minutes or so for questions. And then we'll take a 10-minute break. And then at that point, if you're not a payroll user, you can drop off at that point because we will then go through the payroll process. So you'll definitely want to stick around if you're a payroll HR user, because then we'll be doing that at the end for about the last hour or so. And then we'll have a little bit of time for additional questions after that. All right, so that's the order of the topics that we'll go through. Okay, so the first thing I just want to mention is as far as the different versions of GP, hopefully you're on version 2015 or later. The main support for 2013 has ended back in April, and the year-end updates are no longer available for version 2013. So I just wanted to mention that. And then we also have some information on future support life cycles for versions 2015, 16, and 18. So we still have support going for version 2015 through 2020. And then even beyond that for the newer versions. And then if you do have the need to print the forms for the ACA, then you will need to be on one of these versions as well. So you would not be able to do that on version 2013 or earlier. So again, you can download this to this PowerPoint presentation that we're using. So if you wanted to reference this graph again, feel free to download that and take a look and let us know if you have any questions about that. As part of the year-end update, there is a year-end update that you can install, and if you install that, then it does include, if you're on Dynamics GP version 2018, it includes Release 2. So Release 2 was an update that came out, and it had a lot of different issues and bug fixes out there, and they've actually bundled that in with the year-end tax update. So when you download that, it will require updating the workstations and everything, and you'll get R2 updated on there as well. And there are, on the next page, we'll go through some of them, but there are a lot of bug fixes in version 2018. So you might want to, get that update on there just to be able to take advantage of all those fixes as well. So I do want to mention it's not required unless you're using, one of these form changes here. So as far as payroll is concerned, there are no W-2, W-4, W-3 form changes this year. So I think that's definitely a relief for a lot of people. So it's not necessary if you're just printing W-2s or if you're just, if you don't need any of the payroll or the ACA changes. Now, there were some changes to the 1099 DIV form, 1096, and the 1099R. So if you're going to be using any of those forms for payables, then you would want to install the year-end update to be able to get those latest updates for those forms. And then the Affordable Care Act did have some changes in the 1095 forms. So if you are processing that, if you're using the HR module in GP and you need to be able to print those ACA 1095 forms, then you will want to make sure that you get this year-end update for that purpose as well. And then I just there's a note on here that it does not support e-filing for ACA. So you would have to actually print out those forms, or if you want to do that in the future, let your CAM know, because there are some third-party products out there that can help you with that. But the base GP does not allow the e-filing for ACA. Okay, so in this slide deck here, we did include a lot of the bug fixes in case you wanted to reference those. And there's a couple in here that definitely helped out a lot of customers. So you'll want to consider getting the year-end update if you're experiencing any of these problems. So one of them is just a slow performance when you're looking up payables documents in this inquiry window. And then there are a few things that are really helpful if you're using payroll. Some of the complaints that have come up just related to the pay dates, with pay codes not being included. If the start date falls between pay periods, I know that was a big one. And then if you're using the payroll integration to payables, there's a fix related to that with the federal tax on tips. So definitely look through these. Those are probably the main ones I think that I've seen a lot of, that are common corrections I want to take advantage of. And then we have some additional fixes that were included for version 2016 and 2015 on here. So we've laid out all of these for you. So if you're on any of these older versions, then take a look at this list and see if, if there's anything that you're experiencing on a regular basis, and that'll help you make the decision whether you need to install the year-end update or not. Okay, so moving into preparation. So it is really important to just, properly plan for your year-end closing process. The actual process shouldn't take too long. You're already taking the best step here with coming to the webinar and, getting the manual and, reading through and understanding everything. And that'll help you plan so you know how much time you need and coordinate with everybody. So you'll want to make sure that you schedule everything based around your procedures and any critical tasks that you have. And we'll go through some of the timing questions when we get into, especially around payables and payroll, just some of the timing constraints that you want to take note of for that. And then, of course, this is extremely important. Just make sure that you have a backup before you begin. It's really easy to restore if you need to at any point. So just make sure that you've backed up your data. A lot of times you'll have to work with someone in your IT department to coordinate that. So make sure you give them a heads up, or make sure that there's a backup there before you start the process. And then there are some maintenance and cleanup tasks that are optional, but they definitely help. So hopefully you've been running the month-end process and you've been kind of keeping up with your data. If not, you'll want to leave a little extra time for that just to make sure that you're able to run the file maintenance. And then any there are some, extra cleanup tasks that you could do if you have a lot of extra data in your system that you don't need, that are, like inactive accounts, or, any employees that need to be inactivated, and vendors. It's helpful to get that done ahead of time as well. And then also leave a little bit of time. If you haven't ran any reconcile procedures, it's recommended that you reconcile these modules as well. So as far as the order of the year-end close process, and you'll notice that in the manual, after our general tips and reminders section, it starts in this exact order. So we have a full section of pages on each topic in here, so it's exploded out with every step. And then the manual also has a section on each topic where it talks about any common questions and just facts that you might want to know related to that module. So you'll start with basically, if you had any, if you're using sales order processing, purchase order processing, there's not technically a year-end close process that needs to run, but it is recommended to have those modules reconciled. It's just helpful so that, you have clean data and that all your inventory is correct as well. So there's no year-end close process in sales order processing or purchase order processing. And then the actual year-end process starts with inventory. So when you get to inventory, there are some steps that we'll go through that you'll want to perform there. And you'll want to perform everything in this order. So you'll start with inventory if you're using it. If not, then you could start with receivables and then payables, and then fixed assets if you're using it. And it is important to do that just so that if you do have a link between payables and fixed assets, you'll want to make sure you close payables out first. And then the final one after all of those modules is the general ledger. So you do want to make sure that you complete all of these sub-ledgers first before you close out the general ledger. And then after that is payroll. So payroll, of course, is based on the calendar year. So you want to make sure that you, do it after your final 2018 pay run. Okay, so now what we'll do is we'll look at the steps that are required for each module. So as I mentioned, in sales order processing, if you're performing your period end procedures, there really aren't any extra steps that you need to perform. It is recommended that you reconcile your sales documents and remove any completed sales documents, and then print some reports just so that you have those on file. And then similar with purchase order processing, it's helpful to reconcile your purchasing documents and remove the completed purchase orders. And that just helps also with, as far as sales order processing and purchase order processing, it helps with just the overall performance of your system. If you're running these procedures, it moves the data to different tables. So then when you're working with active sales orders and purchase orders, your system's going to run a lot faster because it doesn't have all of that history, sitting in the same table there, slowing everything down. So it's a good idea to do that anyway, just to have good performance. And then there's some month-end reports related to purchase order processing that are recommended that you have. So we have those listed out here for you. Okay, so now we get to a section where we actually do have a year-end close process. So for inventory management, you do want to run through this process, assuming you're using the inventory module within GP. If you're not using it, you don't have to do anything here. So ideally, you'd want to close it, at the end of your fiscal year before any new transactions that would affect quantities would be posted. And basically, a lot of the steps around inventory are more related to, making sure that all of your data is correct. So you'll want to post all your transactions, and then you'll want to reconcile your quantities, and basically make sure everything's correct there, and complete, a full physical inventory count. It's always helpful to do that and make sure that you have correct inventory quantity balances in GP and that matches what's actually out in the warehouses. And then go through and print some reports that are recommended here. It's recommended to make a backup at that point, just because now you know that you have all the correct numbers in the system, and you'll want to have a backup with any adjustments that you made during these previous steps. This way, if something goes wrong during the actual close process, you can then restore to this point right here and have a backup, with the correct quantities. And then at this point, you're running the actual close, where you actually run the close process for inventory. And during that step, when you're closing the year, you'll have a few options in that window that we'll look at as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight some of these different steps in GP, just so that you can visually see where the windows are at and get an idea of what that process looks like. Okay, so I'm in GP version 2018, and I have R2 on here as well. So this is the most current version up here, and I'm going to go over to the inventory module here. So the first thing is, of course, make sure that everything's been posted for the year. And then the next thing would be to reconcile. So a lot of the year-end procedures you're going to find on the utilities and routines menus here. And in our manual, we have really detailed steps. So you'll definitely want to look at that. It'll tell you, how to get to every single window that I reference in here, so you don't have to remember it as we're going through. But the first step would then be to reconcile. So I would go to this window here. And now this is something that you might want to plan as far as timing for, because it is possible that this could take a long time. It depends on how much inventory you have, how much history you have related to all the items in your system, if you've had a lot of transactions. So definitely keep that in mind. You'll want to leave a little bit of cushion of time for this process. Ideally, you could even start it at night, because you'll need everyone out of the system anyway. So you could start this process at night and let it run through. And then, if you have a large amount of inventory, I would recommend doing that. And then you could come back in the morning and it would be done for you. Want to reconcile first. And then you'll want to complete your physical inventory, and you can post adjustments that you have after you run that. If you've done, period end or just cycle counts in the past, then you'll be familiar with that process already. But you can use the stock account entry window for that, and you can, make all your adjustments that way, or you can make manual adjustments up here in the transaction entry window. So after all of your inventory balances are updated in GP and all your adjustments are in there, then you'll want to print your reports. So on the reports menu over here, there's some that are recommended. A lot of them are under activity menu. So under activity, we have this historical stock status. So that's definitely a good one to run. And I have an example on here. If there's nothing here, you could create new and create a report option here. So I just gave this one as an example. I have it restricted since I'm using this Fabricam test company out here. I'm actually using everything that we're doing today will be in the year 24, because that's the year that's open in this demo company. So we're going to be closing 24 today. So I just included that date as an example here. And I have it in three. And I'm not including zero quantity, so I just did a couple things on here to make the report a little bit cleaner. And just to give you an example of one of the reports here, I could print that out here, and then it's basically going to go through and it's going to tell me all my quantities for all my items, and it's going to use the settings that I have on here. And then there's also some other reports that are recommended. So this is the stock status, and this one's pretty helpful. There's a purchase receipt report. And then if you use some of the turnover reports, that if you're using that, a lot of times they'll be used during period end, then you'll probably want to have an updated one for the year end as well. But this stock status report looks like. So it's basically just going to show you for every item, your quantity, and then your total cost, and then at the bottom it'll tell you your total quantity and total cost. So you'll be able to have record of that, and you'll know that that's your actual inventory quantity at year end. Okay, so after you've printed any reports that you think are relevant and that you want to hold on to, you would make a backup, and then we'd run the actual close process in the inventory module here. So one thing I just want to point out is one of the things that will happen is go to the item quantities window here, and I'm just going to pull up an item as an example. You'll notice that we have different values in here, so it shows what's sold and everything in here. And so a lot of the procedures that happen during the year end will update the quantities in this window. So I just wanted to point that out. Right now it's showing that there's been 78 sold for that item. And because it's going to transfer a lot of this information over, so it's going to actually, when we run the next step here where we close the year, it's going to zero out that quantity sold for every site. And then it's also going to update some of the beginning quantity values. And those are used on the turnover report. They're also used on some smart list reports. So a lot of the values that it updates, you'll see updated on your smart list and everything. So it's going to transfer a lot of that information to history and then update those quantities. So what we would do next is through the actual close process here under this routines menu. So we would go to year-end close, and then you can choose some of these selections on here as well. Whether you want to remove any discontinued items that have been completely sold, you can mark that. And then there's some other options related to lots and receipt numbers on here. Otherwise, you can leave this. You would just hit process here. And now it's running. And luckily, I don't have a huge amount of inventory in this test company here. So the process went pretty quickly, you'll notice. So you'll definitely want to give a little bit of time if you have a high volume of inventory items in the system. Okay, so now if I go back to when I ran that process, if I go back to this item here as an example, you'll notice that this sold value has now been zeroed out. So that's one of the things that was completed as part of the year-end close process that we just ran. Okay, so the last thing then that you would do, and it's recommended to do each one of these steps just so that nobody's using the module. So now that you've basically ran the year-end close, you would want to close that module. Close this out here, and if I go up to my Dynamics GP window and go to Setup, Company Fiscal Period, what I would want to do is, in this case, we're closing 2024. And you'll notice that in here, 2023 is a historical year. It's been closed. I'm in 2024. And what I would want to do is close my inventory module here. So I'm not going to go through and close all of them. But in your case, you'd probably have everything closed except December would be open. So then you'd want to just mark this box here for December. And that would any users from accidentally posting something in the inventory module in December, since you want your records to be locked at this point since you've ran the close process. Okay, so that's that's everything related to the inventory module. So it's so there's really not, there's not too many procedures that actually have to be done within the system. Inventory is more, it's heavily focused on just making sure that your quantities are correct and running that physical inventory, making sure that everything's updated in GP, before you actually run the process. So a lot of that is more of a, a physical process, and then the steps in GP are pretty minimal. Okay, so we'll do our presentation here. So we went through everything for inventory. Now we'll move on and we'll talk about receivables management. So now that we're getting into receivables and payables as well, what's important to remember here is that there are a lot of areas in the system that they're kind of date sensitive, just meaning that when you run your close process, you want to make sure that you get the timing right. So ideally, this applies to receivables and payables. You'd want to make sure that you've posted all transactions for 2018. Because what's going to happen is there's some windows that I'll point out to you where it holds data for the year. So it'll show you year-to-date sales, year-to-date payments and everything. And in some locations in GP, that is based purely off of when you close the year. So it's not going to look at the actual dates of the transactions. Now, there are some windows that will do that where, of course, you can restrict it by the date of the transaction. And you can see it, by calendar year and by fiscal year. But there are some spots that it basically just looks at the amounts since the last close. And there's some smart list reports, and there's some windows that just look at the amounts since you closed the year. So if you, as long as you close the year at the right time, then that's great. But if you've already posted, 2019 transactions and then you close your year, it's going to include those 2019 transactions and the amount since the last close fields. So we definitely recommend that you, post all of your transactions for the year first, just to make sure that everything's accurate in all of those different windows. So moving into the actual steps that are required for the receivables close here. There's not too many. So with receivables, again, it's more of a timing thing. And this is also assuming that you've been, working through your period end procedures. So just like any other month, you'll want to make sure that you have all of your period end processes done as well. You'll want to make sure that you've, printed your customer statements, ran your aging, and made sure that all of your receivables data is accurate for December, of course, before you move forward and close the year. So after posting all your transactions, it's recommended just to make a backup so you have that. And then you basically go through the close year process. And that's going to move a lot of the amounts into the last year bucket that I referenced on here. And then you could close your periods in your fiscal period setup window, just like we did in inventory, to make sure that the users don't accidentally post to December at that point. And then if you're using different tax data, then there's also a tax process that you can run to close that. Okay, so what we can do is we'll, just like inventory, we'll jump over to GP for a moment here so we can look at some of these steps. Okay, so at this point, you've posted all of your transactions for the year and you've made a backup. So now we're ready to move forward. And what I'll do is I'll point out a couple of the windows just so you're familiar with what I mentioned with the date sensitivity and everything. So a lot of the information that is not, not date sensitive is stored in the summary windows, the sales here. And your cards, we have this summary window. So if I just pull up the first customer as an example here, you'll notice we have a lot of these year-to-date, last year, life-to-date buckets. And what happens is if you're also using smart list reports, a lot of those reports are also using, these fields. And in our year-end close manual, it's very detailed. It even lists out for you, in case you're wondering, it lists out all the fields that are dependent on this. So if you're curious what those fields are that are based on the timing of the year-end close, there's actually a list in there in the receivable section where it'll show you what all of those different date-sensitive fields are. So in here, it'll show you, you'll notice that we have the summary view. And right now, I'm looking at amounts since last close. So this is the option that is purely based on when we close the year. So when I close the year, it's going to take everything in this year-to-date column here, and it's going to then move it into this last year column. So you could see why it's important just to get the timing right if you're relying on any of these fields for any of your reports. Now, there's a way to still see it based on the transaction dates, but you do have to change this. And so if I switch this over to calendar year as an example, now I can see the year in the periods. I can even restrict it to a certain period if I wanted to, and then I could click calculate, and it'll actually calculate for me based on all of the transaction dates on those different documents, and it'll tell me what my year-to-date sales amount is, payments, and everything. It'll tell me how many I had. So this would actually be calculated. So you can still get to this data. However, a lot of the smart lists and the reports, they don't use these fields. Those are all driven off of these fields here. And this is important in, in the receivables module, if you're using those reports and everything, but it's especially important in payables, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes, just because with payables, you want to make sure that if you're using, if you have any 1099 vendors, you want to make sure that all of those amounts are correct for your 1099 forms. Okay, so I'm going to close out of here now, and then we'll look at the actual process. So just like most of the modules, you're going to find it under routines, and under routines, it also lists out, a lot of the different steps that you would use when you're going through your month-end close. So under routines, you'll see that there's a link, aging, generating finance charges if you're using those, printing your statements, and kind of in order and laid out for you. And those are all the steps you'll want to make sure you have done for the month of December before you move into your year-end close process, including paid transaction removal, which is that last step. And if you're doing that on a monthly basis, then that's great. You'll want to make sure you run that. Make sure you have a good, month-end close for December, because then it'll take all of your transactions, all of your invoices that have been fully paid, and it'll move them over to the historical status. So it kind of locks everything down at that point. And then once you've had all of those different steps completed, then you'll run the actual year-end close. So this is pretty straightforward. If you have a different fiscal year, they do give you those options in here, so you could restrict it to calendar. So if you wanted to just close your calendar year at this point, you could do that. Otherwise, if your fiscal and calendar year are the same, you would just select all here. Just hit process. And it's going to prompt you to make sure I want to close it. So I would say, and then it's going to give me reports here. And it's recommended, to hold on to these reports. You could print them to a file if you want, and just hold on to them for future reference if needed. So in here, it's going to show you basically everything that it transferred. It's going to show you all your year-to-date amounts for all your customers and the statistical information for them. And then it'll also give you some salesperson reports. If you're using salespeople and sales territories, it'll show you all of those values for the year for your salespeople and the different commissions and everything too. And then the same thing with territory. Okay, so it ran in the background. It was really fast, but it did run the close process for us. And so now if we look here, we go back to our summary window as an example, and on this first customer that we were looking at earlier, you'll notice that it transferred everything. So now my year-to-date column is completely blank, and it's ready so that the next transaction that I post related to the receivables module will then get updated into this year-to-date bucket here. And then you'll notice that my last year has also gotten updated. So everything that was in the year-to-date bucket is now in the last year bucket. And then, of course, life-to-date got updated as well. So that's the main process that the receivables year-end close goes through. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to. The last thing then would be if you're using tax schedules and tax details and the different reports to track your different tax figures, then you want to also close out your tax year. So that's also found in the same menu here. So you would want to actually go through and you would actually want to go to the company menu. So we would go to Tools, Routines, Company, and on here there's a tax year window. So we would actually run through that as well, and then it'll give you some reports that you might need for your company as well in that window. Okay, so that's everything related to receivables. And now we're going to move over to the Payables module. And you'll notice that the payables procedures and everything are pretty similar. The main difference is that with payables, you also have the vendor 1099s that I mentioned, but the process is essentially the same. So just like receivables, there's a lot of areas in the system that the fields are based on when you actually closed the year. So a couple of things I just want to mention. There's no new functionality in 2018 that affects the actual year-end processing, there's no changes to the most popular 1099 form, which is the 1099-MISC for miscellaneous box numbers. There's no changes to that form. So if you're just using the standard payables module and you're using the standard 1099 form, you don't have to do the year-end tax update. So I just wanted to point that out. Of course, you'll want to look at all the bug fixes and everything and factor in that as well. But if you're just using payables, you don't need to do that. You'll still get a correct 1099 form. And just like everything else in the receivables module, it's going to transfer all of the amounts to those, those different fields there based on when you close the year. So for payables, it is very important that you have processed all of your vendor payments for 2018, before you actually run through this year-end close process to make sure that you have accurate amounts. Okay, so I'm going to move over to the next slide. So similar to receivables, you'll want to make sure that you've had everything posted for the year, and then you'll want to print some reports. It's recommended to have a historical aging report printed out. And then there's also a couple other reports that are recommended on here, just a period analysis report, which will show you vendor amounts by period. And then it's recommended to make a backup before you do anything with your 1099. So if you need that, you have a pre-1099 edit backup. And then at that point, you'll want to verify all of your 1099 information. And then you can make some edits to those 1099 amounts if you need to. And then you can print out your 1099 statements. So the important thing to remember here, printing your 1099 statements, it can be done anytime before or after your year-end close. So the important thing for that is just that you've posted all 2018 payments to your vendors before you print your 1099 statements. So after you've printed those 1099s, then you can make another backup so that you have that with all of those adjustments on there. And at that point, you're ready to run the actual close the year process and close your periods and everything. So those are all the steps for payables. So it's not too bad there. And there's a couple extra things in receivables, mainly related to the 1099s. So what we'll do now is we'll go through and look at some of those windows so you can see what they look like inside GP. Okay, so I'm going to move over to purchasing. And I'll point out just so you can see the same thing, similar to receivables. If I go to the summer window here, and I pull up, the window's similar, but there's a couple extra windows as well on the payable side. So here, there's a couple basic information that it'll tell you, some year-to-date, life-to-date information. But then there's also this year window, and this is the window where if you don't close the year at the right time, you're going to have some inaccurate information in here. So right now, I made the amount since the last time I ran my close. And just like receivables, I could calculate and find out if these values are inaccurate. I could calculate. I could just a calendar year, and I could say 2024. Calculate, and now I can see what my true year-to-date amounts are based on those 2024 transaction dates. But my smart lists and a lot of my reports and everything are going to be using these amounts here. Now, these amounts can be updated as well, but that's quite a task. So it's definitely wise to time out your payables year-end close process properly. So at this, I want to make sure that you've posted everything for the year. And then it's recommended to print a couple reports. So if I go over to reports here and trial balance, where I'll find the historical trial balance report that's referenced in our manual here. So if I go to historical aged trial balance, there's a demo one out here, or you could do a new one by this. And I can just do it in summary. And in this example, I'll print it as of the end of 2024. Now I'll just go to here. And then there's a couple questions that you could put in there as well if there's anything you want to include. And here it'll give me a summary. You could also print this in detail if you wanted to see all of the invoices and the payments that are making up each one of these buckets. But in this example, I just printed the summary one so you could find out how many vouchers are open, what the total amount is, and what bucket are they in. So if I go down to the end, I can get a total here. Okay, so this will tell me, how many vendors I have, and it'll tell me my total, total payables that were due in this historical point in time. So, if I wanted to look at 12/31, then it's showing me all those values there. And then you could also a period analysis report for you, and that report will basically just show you all the activity by period for you. Or that one can be kind of a big report, but it's helpful if you want to save that information in case you need it in the future. Okay, so at this point you'd want to make a backup just so that you have it, since you've ran your reports, you've posted all of your transactions that affect payables, but you haven't actually changed anything yet with your 1099 amounts. And then a couple things I did want to point out just so you could see kind of that 1099 process. There's a couple different windows that they have that you can look at the 1099 information in. So the first thing that I'll show you is under cards. You have this 1099 details window. And again, this is all in our manual. So we have the payables section in the manual has a lot of information on 1099s in here, including some common questions that customers might have ran into just related to the timing and, trying to edit the amounts and everything. Okay, so I'm going to go in here and pull up this first vendor here. And this window is only going to show you 1099 vendors, so you won't see your other vendors in here at all. And this is going, right now it's looking at tax type miscellaneous, and then it's looking at just the month. I'm going to change this to year, and I'm going to change my year 2024. So you'll notice that this vendor is a 1099 vendor, and they do have an amount in box 7 here for the year 2024. So this is what you would expect to appear on the 1099 form. And then if I keep going, I'll see another one. And so just as an example here, so the first thing you'll want to do is just start reviewing all of your 1099 amounts. Make sure that everything looks correct, and you can make any edits at this point if you need to, since we haven't printed the 1099 statements yet. So if I needed to make an edit to one of these amounts, then what I could do is I could change my year to month, and then I would need to just find the month, that payment was made for this vendor, and I could then edit the amount here. So if I wanted to change this, if it was incorrect, and I don't know, maybe it included some 2019 checks or something that shouldn't be in there, I could then change this. So maybe it should just be 10,000. Save that. Pull up my vendor again, and then if I look at the year, you'll notice that now the year is showing 10,000. So it's pretty simple to update those. If you're finding anything that is incorrect, you can come in here, and they've enhanced this a lot over the last few versions, so they've made this process a lot easier to handle. So now if I wanted to actually print my 1099, if I go into routines, I would go to print 1099. And you'll want to make sure that all of your, company information is correct, of course, since this is what's going to print on the form, and then make sure your federal, tax ID number is in here. Now I'm going to change to 2024. And right now I'm printing the actual 1099 form. I could also print this alignment form if I wanted to, just to make sure that everything's lining up with the forms. But it shouldn't be too tricky. They haven't changed this actual form this year. So it should line up. So I'm going to print this screen here. Cool. So now we'll see our 1099 information on here. So we have our first vendor that we looked at, the Beaumont Construction. Get that back up here. Okay. And if I scrolling down here, I don't know why I keep closing that. Let me do this. Oh, that's weird. Okay. Let me try and print that again. Okay, I was just going to demonstrate. Here we go. Okay, so I just wanted to demonstrate the vendor that we updated, ComNet Enterprises. So you'll notice that it is pulling my updated amount that I manually edited in the previous window there. So it is showing $10,000 for my total amount based on the update that I made. So at this point, all your 1099s should be correct. And we do have some tips in our manual as well. If you're running into any alignment issues, since they haven't changed the form, it should be pretty simple. But if you are running into anything, there's some tips on how you can basically change like the vertical and horizontal alignment when you're printing this. If you need to move everything up slightly or down slightly so that it lines up, really nicely, fits into all those boxes for you. Okay, I'm going to close that then. And so at this point, your 1099 forms to the printer, onto the forms, and everything looks good. So it's recommended, since you've made edits to your 1099s, assuming you have, and you printed them, that you make a backup so that you have it basically, so you have a nice snapshot of where you left off. And then where you can actually run the close process. So what we would do is, like all the other modules, under routines, you would go to year close. And you have in here, just like receivables, you could restrict it to just calendar year if you wanted to. Otherwise, it's going to close both the calendar and the fiscal year. So it's assuming that those are the same. And when you run this close process, similar to the receivables module, it's going to take a lot of the dollar amounts. It's going to transfer it to, the prior year, the last year bucket on there, including your 1099. So that's why, it is important that you have those printed first, because then it's going to take all of your 1099 information for, year to date, and that's going to be moved into last year. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll actually run through this close process just so you can see that. So I'll leave all on here. Report, that's fine. Okay, so it's going to show me for each vendor, it's going to show me the total amounts, number of invoices, and just all of the on here. So this is also recommended and able to have this stored somewhere for reference if needed. Just when we get to this vendor, this was our first vendor that we saw in our 1099 window. So this vendor does have a 1099 amount as well. And the other, to show the main amounts that were on there. Okay. Takes this window as well, so you can see the last time that it was actually closed. Of course, it's using my demo company here, so it's using April 12th, 2027 based on my user date, but it'll show me when I close here. And then step that you would want to do is just like earlier, we would go back to the Dynamics GP button up here to go to Tools Setup Company. And then we would go to periods and make sure that we close that out. 2024, you have everything open actually, so I'll leave it so it shows like you would probably have everything else closed at this point, and you would just have financial open because we've on payroll. So at this point, we would want to make sure that we close payables. And so now basically the only modules that the users could post to at this point in time would be payroll, if using that, and then the financial module. So keep in mind, you can open and close these. It's kind of a soft close. So if I did need to open it and make some sort of adjustment, I could easily just uncheck that box and check it again. Those are all driven, by the user, and you can open and close periods. They simply prevent the users from using transaction dates within those periods. Now that's different than this up here, this historical year. You'll never actually check this box. This is driven by the system. When we run the actual financial year-end close process, it will check this for us. So this you don't want to change. But all of these you can open and close as often as you need to. Okay, so if we look now as an example at summary, we go back to our cards, purchasing cards summary window. You'll notice that year to date has been cleared out, and so the yearly, and I see my amount since last close, it's now all blank. So now it's all ready to go. So then the next action that you post, regardless of the date, it's going to throw that amount into this year to date bucket here. So it's starting to collect it for the next year. And then it moved everything that we just got moved into this last year column here. And then, of course, calculate it if we wanted to. Okay, so that's everything that needs to be done on the payables module. Back over to our presentation here. And so we went through all these payable steps here. And now we're going to move on. So the next is fixed assets. And you'll want to make sure that you go through this process if you're using the fixed assets module in here. And you'll want to make sure that you do it at this point in time because now you've closed payables. You know, anything that's been purchased is completed, and you know that that's locked down and done. So any purchasing that may affect fixed assets has been completed. And you'll want to make sure you close fixed assets, and then because then you'll be at the end and you can do your general ledger closing after that, and you'll be all done. So the important thing for fixed assets is just to make sure that you run the routine before you process any fixed asset transactions for 2019. So that's important. And then of course, as I mentioned, it's important that you close fixed assets before the general ledger. There really isn't any you know, new functionality this year that affects the process if you ran it in prior years. On newer versions of GP, though, there is a year-end closing report that was added. So definitely take advantage of that. Hopefully you're on a newer version, you can use that. And that report is helpful because it'll show you, you know, per book, it'll show you your assets, your year-to-date depreciation, accumulated depreciation, and then some other, you know, values on that report as well, so that you can see basically all the assets that are impacted by the year-end close process. So what's nice is you can now, in a single step, you can close the year and you can get that status report all at once. So looking at the different steps that we'll want to go through for the fixed assets module. So as I mentioned, you'll want to make sure you have payables done, which we just went through. You'll want to enter all of your fixed asset transactions for 2018. And then, so this is important, you'll want to make sure that you run your depreciation and depreciate all of your assets through the current year. So, you know, you'll want to have them depreciated through December 31st, 2018, assuming you're on a calendar year. This way, you know that you have correct, year to date and life to date depreciation amounts stored with each asset. And then after you've run your depreciation for the year, you'll want to, it's recommended to perform your GL posting routine. So that's the process that takes everything from fixed assets and it creates a journal entry. So it's good to do that so that you have all of your journal entries posted related to your 2018 fixed asset entry. On a monthly basis, you're running depreciation for your assets and running your GL posting routine anyway. So it's really the same thing that you're doing in December. It's just that it's important that you do it, before you close out your year so that you have, correct year-to-date amounts. And then there's some different reports that you can print, that are recommended just to have on file for the current year. And then you can verify that your fixed assets calendar is ready, and that your quarters are set up and everything. And then you'll want to make a backup at that point because at this point you've ran depreciation and all of your transactions have gone through. And then once you've done that, then you'll perform the actual fixed asset closing routine. Okay, so I'm going to go back over to GP so we can take a look at how this looks. Okay, so one thing I want to just point out is the year-end close process. What it's going to do is it's actually going to clear the year-to-date maintenance amount, and then it's going to clear out the year-to-date depreciation amount, and update the life-to-date amounts as well. So I'm just going to point out where that's at. If I go to financial here, and look at fixed assets here. So if I go to open up general, just to show you a couple of these fields on here. So in the general window, there's not too much that's related to depreciation, but there is this last maintenance field. There's an expansion here. And in this expansion window, these are the amounts that are going to get updated when you run the year-end close process. So this year-to-date maintenance field and life-to-date. And then if I click go to my book here, I'll just go to internal. So in here, you'll notice this is really important. We have our year-to-date depreciation amount, and then we have our life-to-date depreciation amount. So those are going to get updated. You know, year-to-date, of course, when we close the year, it's going to get cleared out. And then the other thing that will happen is this begin year cost field is going to get updated as well. So whatever you have in this cost basis amount is going to get updated into this begin year cost field. So those are some of the, you know, the different fields that will get updated when you actually run through that year-end, you know, close process. And then the other thing that'll happen automatically is a setup window. So if I go under setup here, this is where I have all my books set up. So this current fiscal year is also going to get updated automatically to the next year once you run that process. So you don't ever want to manually change that. That's completely driven by the year-end close process. Okay, so as far as the process you need to do, as we've mentioned, any transactions, so any new fixed asset additions completed, you should have all of your assets in here at this point. And then you'll want to run depreciation. So under routine fixed assets, we'll go through depreciate, and we'd want to pick our book, you know, in this case would be the end of the year, and insert that, and then run through the depreciate here. And then this way everything will get updated through 12/31 with up-to-date depreciation information. And you ran that, then you'll want to go through your GL postings. So GL posting here and routines. In here, I would process this. Of course, I would put 12/31, and then I'll get all my transactions that are in there related to any recent additions and depreciation. And then when I this, it's going to create my journal entry. And then I would want to post that journal entry as well, since it's affecting 2018 numbers. And then after I've done that, then some reports. So we do have in our manual, we have a recommendation of what reports you should print, but those are all found under reports financial fixed assets here. So a lot of those will be under depreciation and activity. You'll be able to post different reports on here. So there's an annual activity, there's a reconciliation report, a lot of full reports in there that you'll want to go through and make sure you save any of them that are important. And then after you've printed all of your reports for the current year, then there's a couple things that are optional on here, and it kind of depends on, you know, your setup and everything. But you have there's a calendar related to fixed assets, so it is recommended just to make sure that that's set up correctly. So if I get a setup menu here, I'm on setup fixed assets and I have calendar, you'll notice that we have our calendar year. So for, you know, right now this data is in 2027, but you'd want to pick your year and just make sure that your calendar looks right. If not, build it. It'll probably already be there, you know, for future years, but if it isn't, you would build it for 2019 so that you have that in there. You could also, there's a link in here, you could also quarters, and you'll want to make sure that all of your quarters are set up properly for 2019 so that that's ready to go. So the, you know, the quarters are, you know, especially important if you're using, you know, depending on what kind of averaging convention you're using for your assets, you'll want to make sure that you have those set up. And then at that point, you'll just make a backup, and then you're ready to run the actual process. So what you'll want to do is just scroll down a little bit here. Routine fixed assets, we have our year, and you would then insert the process is ran for each book, so you'd want to insert the year in the book here, and then just hit continue. And by doing that, you're actually running the close process. And as I mentioned, it's updating a lot of different fields in the book window and quantity field as well, if you're using that for your assets. One thing to take note of that comes up a lot is when I hit, it'll run the process and the window will become active again, but there is not a year-end report that would print in prior versions. So in 2018, there is an actual year-end report that prints out, but if you're on an older version, then you're not going to get an actual report when it's done. So that's everything for the assets. And now at this point, we've completed all the modules except General Ledger. So that's our final module that we'll want to make sure that we always do at the end. And you know, for General Ledger, the most important thing is that you've completed your year-end close for all of the modules that we just went through. So you want to make sure those are all done. And it's recommended to to post any adjusting entries just to keep your year as clean as possible. You are able to post adjusting entries after you run the close. So just keep that in mind. However, if you do that, it is going to create extra entries. So if you've closed 2018 already and it's a historical year, and now you need to run it's 2019 and you want to post an adjusting entry, what's going to happen is it's going to automatically create an extra entry. If it's a P&L account, it would create an extra entry to affect retained earnings. So you'll get kind of like double entries out there, showing that. So it just creates extra data in your system. So it is nice to have those entries posted ahead of time if you can, but you don't have to. You could still post those adjustments. And basically during the year-end close process, it's going to move. There's some open tables related to your your general ledger, and there's some historical ones. So it's going to actually take everything and move them into the historical tables. That's the main process that it goes through. And then, of course, it creates an entry for retained earnings based on the P&L for the year. So a couple things. This is very important. You'll want to make sure that all of your GL accounts are set to the right posting type. And we'll go through this in a moment just so you can see what that looks like. But you'll want to make sure you do that because that's what determines if it carries the balance forward to the next year or posts an entry to retained earnings. So there's a quick smart list we can run to verify that those are correct, and it's definitely worth taking the time to do that. There is kind of a tedious process to fix it if you find yourself in a situation where some accounts were wrong. It is possible to fix it, but it's extra time, so it's definitely worth just making sure that you have it right before you run the process. And then it's also recommended to perform final maintenance, of course, and then making sure that you have the right retained earnings account set up in your general ledger setup window, and then make a backup. And then it's recommended to print a final detailed trial balance, and then any financial statements that you might be running through Management Reporter or FRX if you're still using that. And you'll want to make sure that your new fiscal year is set up. And then after you've done that, you can run through the actual close process and then close the periods. And in addition to that, then you can then update any of your budgets, for the new year, print any updated financial statements, and get all of that set up so that you have that package ready for your full, 2018 year, and then make a final backup. Okay, so we'll go into GP so we can see what the general ledger year-end closing process looks like. Okay, so the first thing that I mentioned was making sure that your GL accounts are set up correctly. So for a general ledger, what we'll want to do is open up financial, and then under cards financial, we'll go to this account. I can show you what we're looking at here. So when you create your account numbers here, there's this posting type option. And this is what determines what happens when you run your year-end close process. So this is where it's really important that all of these are set up correctly. Otherwise, you know, you'll have it carrying a balance forward on a P&L account. You definitely don't want that. But a quick way to verify that is if you go to Microsoft Dynamics GP and then you go to Smart List up here, you could create a quick report here under Financial, and then if you don't have a list of accounts, you could literally just scroll through here, and you know, you could see posting type. And as I scroll down here, you know, these should all be balance sheet until I get to you know, my P&L accounts. So you could easily do that, and you'll notice right here at 4,100. The other thing you could do though, especially if you have a lot of GL accounts, is use filters. So I could say on here that give me a thing where my posting type is equal to P&L as an example. And then I want to add another filter, and I want to put in my main account number. Main account stat, so we can say is less than 4,000. So now we're good. So we don't have anything. So we know that all are set up right. And then we could do the same thing with balance sheet. So show me any accounts that are balance sheet, but then my account number is greater than 4,000. So this will quickly, you know, weed out any accounts that are set up incorrectly. The statistical accounts down here, so those are fine. But if it's up here, this would definitely catch my attention. These accounts would need to be looked at because I see right here, you know, loss accounts, a sales account, add it, it's a balance sheet account. So I'd want to audit those and make sure that all those accounts are back before I run my year-end close process. But that's a nice time saver. You definitely want to go through that and make sure it's right before you actually run the process. Okay, so then the next thing is just verify your settings. So if I go to Setup and then General Ledger here, this is where it's going to pull my retained earnings account. So I want to make sure that that's correct here. I can also close to divisional retained earnings if I'm using a segment and I want to post to multiple retained earnings accounts. I could enter that in here. And then I want to have this allow posting to history marked if I want to be able to post to historical years. So those are the settings. Those are the main settings that you'll want to look at there. Make sure that those are right. And at this point, then you can print your final reports. You'll want to print all your financial statements, and then you'll want to print a trial balance here. So under Reports Financial Trial Balance, I can then print my detailed or my summary trial balance, make sure that I have a copy of that, and make a final backup. So at this point, you know, I'm pretty much ready to go and actual year-end process. And then, of course, you'll want to make sure that your fiscal year is set up for 2019. And once I have all of those different things in place, then I would run through the actual year-end close, which is Teams Financial, and then year-end closing. So you'll notice my retained earnings account is correct since I, you know, checked it in my setup window, and I'm going to be closing 2024, which is good. And then you'll want to make sure that you check this option here if you want to maintain your inactive accounts. Otherwise, the system will automatically remove inactive accounts that don't have balances, which, you know, some companies are fine with that. But some companies want to save those accounts, or they might be using them for budget information. So you'll want to make sure you update those settings based on that there. They did add this reverse historical year button. Keep in mind though that that's intended so that if you ran through your year-end close process and for some reason you want to open that year back up, you can use this button now to open up, reverse out a historical year. It's not meant, though, if something fails during the year-end close process, you'd want to restore it back up and start over and figure out what's going on. So you don't want to use this if the process fails. This would just be to reverse a successful year-end close. So I'm going to hit here. It's just warning me that I have a batch out there. And then I get my report. This example, I have different currencies, so it's going to show me my amount for each currency, but you'll see that it showed me the entry that it made to retained earnings. And then it showed me all the different P&L accounts that made that up. So it actually went through and processed and updated retained earnings for me. So I can close this. And then I'll notice that if I go to my inquiry window, if I go to summary, and then if I pick 2024 as an example, or actually I closed 2024, you'll notice that it now shows history. And if I go to 2025, this line got updated. So this is what happened when I ran my year-end close process. It updated this beginning balance line. And if I look at some of those transactions here, you'll notice the code BBF for balance brought forward. So it's showing me that this is the balance, since cash is a balance sheet account. This is the amount that it actually brought forward into 2025. So that's a quick way to check and just make sure that everything got updated correctly and that the year-end close process worked. And then the last thing you'll want to do for the general ledger at that point, you'll want to go to our fiscal year setup window here. And if I open up 2024, you'll notice that this checkbox is now marked. So this happened automatically when I closed the year. And this is telling GP now that if I post anything in 2024, that it needs to create the automatic, beginning balance forward transactions. So it's going to automatically update retained earnings for me if I post to any dates within 2024, and then it's going to automatically bring balances forward. So I would then close my financial box here, and at this point I would just be left with payroll open, and other than that everything's closed. So now you have 2024 down. You don't have to worry about posting to it. If you did have to post an adjusting entry, you would just go back to that window and uncheck the box under financial series, post your adjustment, and then come back in there and mark the box again to keep it closed. Okay, so at that point we've closed everything, we've updated our periods, and you could adjust your budgets for the new year and then make a final year-end backup. And at that point, you're all done with all the subledger modules and the general ledger. So with all this information, that should go pretty smooth for you, and just follow through the steps just like we did right now. And I just have a couple different resources and things I want to mention in here. So as we mentioned, we have the document for you to download, and it's attached to this meeting. And then we also have a link in here. So this is also attached to the meeting. And in here is the link to the year-end update. So if you do decide that you want to install that year-end update, you can do it from here. We'll have some references just to some other areas that might be helpful to you. So there's just some websites related to support and some blogs and everything, the dynamic community website. And then these are some articles related to the year-end closing process. Wanted to reference any of those. And then some additional resources that we mentioned out here, just related to the blog. And if you needed to log a support incident directly with Microsoft, we have a link for that here. And then there's also a year-end update blog. So check, if you want to look at any of those links, we have all of that in this document for you, so you could quickly get to it. And then we also just want to mention that Crestwood offers cloud services. So this is a great way to kind of minimize maintenance of your system. So we actually offer the hosting of Dynamics GP, where you'll have, your own server basically, and everything that you can access remotely, and you don't have to maintain any of that. And you would just access that through a remote desktop. We also offer Office 365, all these different applications here. And we have, there's also the cloud-based accounting systems now that are available that we just want to mention, which is Acumatica and Dynamics 365. So definitely reach out to your CAM if if you're interested in any of those products, or if you're interested in maybe making things easier in your environment and hosting, hosting your GP environment in our cloud service. Okay, so at this point, we've gone through all of the financial modules. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a couple minutes, about 10 minutes, for any questions that you guys might have related to what we just covered for financials. And then what we'll do is take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to continue with payroll. So if you're not using payroll, then you're welcome to drop off at this point or after the questions. And if you're using payroll, then definitely stick around, come back after the break when we go through that process. And be sure to reach out and make sure you fill out the survey so that we have some feedback on that, and let us know, if you need help with anything. As we mentioned, we have our support department, so feel free to contact them at support@crestwood.com, or contact your account manager if you have any questions. So at this point, we will move over to, we'll allow about 10 minutes for some questions related to what we spoke about.
All right, thank you, Juliet. We do have a couple questions. The first says that our inventory takes significantly longer to reconcile and close than our AR and AP. In order to not hold up the close process, is it possible to close AR and AP modules before we close the inventory module?
Yeah, it is possible. You could do that. I think, as long as you've made sure everything's posted that could affect inventory, then that would be fine. Because, the close process for inventory is mainly just going to be updating, all those quantities and everything in those windows. So yeah, you could switch that around. I don't see any problem with that.
Okay, and the next one says, where did you define the new periods for the next year, or does that auto-populate?
The new periods for the next year?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's at the top here. You do have to populate it under this Microsoft Dynamics GP button, tools, setup, company, and fiscal. Sometimes on newer versions, I've seen where some of the years are already set up, but you definitely want to go in here and check. And so like if I needed to create the next, I would put in 2029 empty. And so then I would just tell it how many periods I have in the first and last day of the year and calculate. And now it populated and it created all of those periods in here.
Okay, the next one says, are we able to close the 2000 AP subledger and process invoices in the 2019 AP subledger and yet keep the 2018 GL ledger open for entries? I sort of tripped over myself there. Did that make sense?
Oh, yeah. I think so. So close 2018 for AP and process 2019 for AP, but then leave the GL open. So you can, the important thing with AP is just that that you've had 2018 closed out before you run 2019. And it is possible to do that. You don't need to post the 2019 activity to the GL, and you can leave the GL open as well. If you wanted to post that to the GL and then just leave it open, you could do that as well. For the GL, the biggest timing thing there is more related to when you need your financial statements, because it's not going to update retained earnings, and then it's not going to roll anything forward until you run the GL year-end closing process. So as long as you're okay, and you don't need your financial statements yet, you can leave the GL open. You don't have to run the GL year-end close process, right away. I've seen, I think it's probably common actually, a lot of companies want to try to get as many adjusting entries in the system first before they close. So I see a lot of companies that leave it open, through January, until they have all their adjustments made for 2018, especially since a lot of times you're not going to need your final 2018 statements yet anyway. So you'll just want to make sure that you close it before you run, your statements, financial statements.
Okay, and the next one says, can you explain how to do a backup of the system?
Yeah, what you would need to do is, usually you'll need someone in your IT department to do that, because it does require using SQL Server, which most users won't have access to. But if you do have access, to SQL Server, then, which would be on your server, then you would basically just open that up. And you would go to the SQL Server Management Studio. And, someone that has rights to this would then connect. They would need the proper, security access to do that. And then they would go to their databases. And it is recommended to back up your company databases and the Dynamics database. For the year-end close process, it does update some of the tables in the Dynamics database. So you would want to go to Dynamics as an example, right-click, and then go to Tasks Back. And then a location here, and it would have the BAK file, and this would probably be on your server. So you would pick that location. You could give it a name if you want. And then you just hit OK, and it's going to create a backup file. And then you'd want to do the same for all of your company databases. So in this case, I just have this example demo company, but if you had multiple databases, you want to run through the same process, each company database. And, the other thing you could do is, depending, how much data you have, if you don't have a very large volume environment and everything, another thing you could do is you could time that out, because most likely, you have a backup plan where backups are being ran nightly. I know that we always set up backup plans for all of our clients when we set up their environments, and usually everything's getting backed up automatically at 10 p.m. or midnight every night. So if you plan it out, you could start the process in the morning before entering any transactions, and you already have a full set of backups from the night before waiting to go. So that's another option too. So you'll want to definitely check with whoever handles your system administrator or someone in your IT department to coordinate that.
All right. Okay, I'm sorry. Our next one is there a way for GP to prepare 1099s based on payment dates? Meaning if I have a pay run in 2019 but don't close AP for 2018, am I still able to run those 1099s for 2018? They're hoping that the system will be smart enough to identify a pay run date to prepare the 1099s without the ledger being closed.
So the actual pay date is is 2019, like the check date. Well, there's some fields that will not be that will not get updated. So just keep that in mind. Like the different fields that we looked at in the payables module, that the amount since last year will not. And as far as the 1099s, it is best to actually not generate payments for 2019 until you ran your 1099 amounts. So I would try to keep that clean and kind of keep your payments for 2018 only. I wouldn't process 2019 payments if you could avoid it, before printing your 1099.
Okay. Do we have time for 2 more questions, Juliet, or is it time for a break?
No, we could probably do 2 more.
Okay. One more this one says, I inherited my computer setup and I'm also new to the company. Where do they find tools if they don't have the Microsoft Dynamics GP button at the top? Or is that something I should send to maybe a CAM?
Yeah, what's probably happening if you don't have this, everything on here, the main menus will be set up, utilities and routines. So another way that you could check is if let's say you're in financial, you can look and see, do you have routines, utilities, and setup? Those are the ones, especially routines will be needed for the year-end close process. If you don't have those in there, then it's probably a security access. So you probably need your security updated so that you have access to those areas.
Okay, and this last one says, will inactivating a fund balance account that is no longer used have any effect on the GL close?
No, the only thing you'll want to make sure is when you run the close, you'll just want to make sure you mark that button if you want to keep it, to keep that account number. But yeah, inactivating it won't affect anything on the close. It just prevents you from being able to post to that account.
Okay, and I think that's it for the questions for now, Juliet. Are we ready for a break?
Yes, we are. So we'll take a 10-minute break. So it's 11. Yeah, so we'll come back in 10 minutes, a little bit before 11:50, and we'll get started with the payroll module.
Okay, thank you. I set my timer. I'll see you all back here. Anybody who's staying for payroll in about 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks everyone. All right, thanks everyone for returning after that break. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go through, for those of you that are using the payroll module on Microsoft Dynamics GP, we're going to go through the payroll year-end close process. Okay, so on over here to payroll. So at this point, we've completed all of our year-end close, procedures for other modules, and we're left with going through the payroll procedures, which, as I mentioned, of course, that's important that you time that out right as well with your calendar year and processing payroll for 2018. So the first thing that we want to just mention here is we want to talk about some of the year-end updates that were specific to payroll. So some of the changes included, again, keep in mind that the year-end update includes 2018 R2, so it will update your actual release version that you're using, which will include a bunch of other bug and issue fixes on Dynamics GP if you're running 2018. And then the other thing that's important to remember is there were no W-2 changes. So I know that's the big one this year. The W-2 form has stayed the same, along with the W-4, W-3, and then as we mentioned earlier, some of the payables forms as well. The one thing that is important to remember, though, is if you're using the HR module inside of GP and you need to run the forms for the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, you will want to make sure that you run this year-end update because there are changes to those forms. So that tax update will include the 1095-C, 1094-C changes. And you'll want to make sure that you install this year-end update before you run through this process so that you have the latest form changes. And again, that's only if you're printing this form out of GP. and you would need the human resources module to be doing this. If you need to e-file those forms, though, you would need to use a third-party product. So definitely let us know if that's something you're interested in doing. Otherwise, you would have to, physically print those forms out of the system. And then you also have the option to print your W-2s on blank paper if you're on version 2016 R2 or later. So just a couple points there that we wanted to make. And then the next slide, we just referenced some important dates to keep in mind. So some of these, of course, have already passed, but all the updates have been released and everything. The year-end update has been released. There's also been some third-party products. Integrity Data had their HR release as well the week of December 3rd. And they're already starting to release some of the 2019 tax updates. So after we'll go through all the steps, but after you run through your year-end close process, then you want to make sure you install your 2019 tax tables before you process 2019 payroll. And so that's is being released this week, the round 1, and then round 2 is expected to be released in mid-January. We don't have all the details around that yet, though. But if there are any changes that are made that are necessary for the 2019 tax calculations, then that round 2 tax update will be released around mid-January. And then just a reminder about your deadline, of course, January 31st, 2019, you need to make sure that you have, all your W-2 sent out to your employees. If you're e-filing your W-2, you want to make sure that you have that completed, and then making sure that all the vendors have received their 1099 forms as well, and the IRS has received your vendor 1099 information. So you have a little bit of, a good month at least to get all of that worked out and everything. And then the deadline for the ACA deadlines are on here as well. So we have a little bit more time for that. So March 4th, you need to make sure you have your 1095-Cs to employees. They did change that date, so just take note of that. And then the filing deadline to the IRS is by April 1st. So hopefully that's helpful to have all those dates kind of there, and make sure you grab a copy of this PowerPoint, slide deck so that you can easily reference all this information. Okay, so the next thing I just want to mention is if you do decide, if you're on version 2018 and you decide to install the year-end update, it includes R2, and R2 does have several new features. So it's definitely recommended, that you get that on there. Even if you don't do it for the tax update, you still want to think about doing it soon. And if you need help, feel free to reach out to your account manager, and, we can schedule someone to help you with that. Because there was a really nice list of new features that came out with R2. And there's a couple that relate to payroll, so I just wanted to touch on those so that you're aware of them, and it might help you, with your decision around that. So the first one is related to the payroll check register report. So they've actually added some additional totals to that report that weren't there before. So there's the FICA Medicare and the FICA Social Security totals that were added to that report, and so that includes the employee FICA plus employer FICA, and then there's the employee and employer Social Security. So they've added those 2 totals to the reports, and those were not there before. And then the other thing that's been very helpful is in the employee pay code maintenance window, they've actually added 2 fields for a start date or an end date. And this is really nice because then you can enter a start and end date for a new pay code. So you don't have to worry about waiting to create those new pay codes until you're ready to use them, or when to inactivate them. You could basically have control over when those are actually going to be used for new hires and for terminating existing employee information in the system. So that feature has been released. And then the other one is there's a functionality related to shared maximums for benefits and deductions. So you can basically assign a shared calendar year maximum for a group of benefits or a group of deductions. So that can be really helpful if you, as an example, if you have, as a benefit to your to your organization, if you have employees that contribute to 2 different 401k plans, you can then have that shared maximum stored in the system. In prior versions, before R2, it's not possible to do that. You basically have a maximum for each individual code. And then we have a link on here if you want to read more about any of the new features related to Release 2. You can go on there, and there's some additional details and examples out there for you. Okay, so now we'll move into the different payroll year-end closing procedures here, and we'll go through our checklist. So we'll talk through these, and then we'll look through some examples in GP so you can see the different windows and everything. So the first step is if you're going to install the 2018 tax update, you'll want to make sure that you have that installed first. And then you'll want to make sure that you have completed all of your pay runs for the current year. So all 2018 payroll, you'll want to make sure that you've processed that and that's been completed. And then any monthly and quarterly period end procedures, you'll want to make sure that you have those done as well. And once you've done that, you can make a backup, and it's recommended just to have a backup at that point called pre-year-end wage file, because as part of the payroll close process, you're going to be creating what GP calls a year-end wage file, and that just holds all of the totals for all of your employees for the year, and that's where it holds all the amounts that are going to print on your W-2s. So again, it's optional, but you would then install the year-end update so that you have that if you're going to move forward with that. And we have a note on here just to, if you are going to install it, to make sure that it's installed prior to running the actual year-end close process. Then you just create your year-end wage file, and we'll go through that process in the payroll year-end close window. And it's recommended at that point to make another backup so that you have, a backup before you ran it, and then you have a backup after you ran your year-end wage file. So if you need to get to that again, you can restore back to that point. And the reason that they recommend making a lot of these backups is just so that if something goes wrong at any point in the process, you don't have to start back from the beginning. You could always start from where that backup was left off. So that's why you'll notice a lot of, backups, being listed throughout these checklists. And then you'll want to verify your W-2 information. And if you need to, you can make edits to the W-2 fields for the different employees and everything if necessary prior to, printing them. And then you would just print out your W-2s and your different validation reports. And then once you've done that, then there's a few steps that are, kind of optional, but we list out on here. So one example would be to archive any inactive employee HR information. So that just helps kind of keep the, the system cleared out. And then if you're using the human resources attendance module, then you'll want to make sure that you create the period schedules for 2019 so that those are ready to go before you run your 2019 payroll. And then you'll want to close your fiscal periods for 2018 for the payroll module, just to make sure that nothing accidentally gets posted to those at this point. And then at this point, you've ran your W-2s and everything's all ready to go. So you'll want to install your tax update for 2019. And then at that point, you're ready to run your 2019 payroll. So that's the important thing here, is just make sure you do not process your 2019 payroll until you've installed this tax update, because that'll have all of the new tax tables that will need to be used for 2019. And then if you have any other statements that you need to print, you can print those at this point. Of course, you could also do that before you run your 2019 payroll as well. This is where you'd want to make sure that if you have any of those requirements for 1099-Rs or for the ACA 1095-C statements, that you get all of those printed out as well, depending on the timing for that. These have some later deadlines, so you could do that before or after your 2019 pay run. And then the last thing on here is optional, but if you do have it set up, it is possible to create an electronic W-2 file. You'll need to have an account set up and everything, but there is the ability to do that as well. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go through and go through these different steps here so you can see what they look like. I will go back over to GP here. Okay, so the first thing that we have on our checklist is just making sure that we have the year, if we're going to use, that we have the latest tax update installed and everything. And we can check that here. And again, we have this mentioned in our manual. We have steps and we have screenshots so that you could see what your windows should look like, so you could verify that everything's out there and that your versions are correct. So I'm going to go to my HR and payroll menu. And if I go under setup payroll and then payroll again, you'll notice that on mine, my last year in update is showing November 16, 2018. So that is what you'll want to verify on your side. You'll want to make sure that it should have that date in your payroll setup window. And then you can also verify what version you're on and if the year-end update has been installed. If I go to this help menu up here and I go to About Microsoft Dynamics GP, you'll see that on here, my version, you'll notice that in parentheses, it has R2. So I did actually install the year-end update and the R2 release on here. So it shows me that, and then it shows me that my version, it ends in 0672. So that's how I know that that's what version number I'm on. Okay, so we know that we have, all the latest updates on there. And then the next thing is just making sure that you've ran all of your pay runs, for 2018 at that point. And then there's a couple other preparation tasks that I'll just point out. We have them in the manual, but I just want to reference them here. You're aware of them. If you go under, I'll move up here a little bit. If we go to the cards section, if we go under card, payroll, and then tax, and I'm in my demo company here, so there are some sample employees with some sample data. And so if I pull up an employee here, you'll want to make sure that if you have employees that are on retirement plans, that you mark this box here. So we have a section for W-2 checkboxes, and then we have retirement plan, and then also statutory employee. It's really important because it does not get marked automatically. If you have an employee and you add them to a retirement plan, it's not going to automatically check that box for you. And if you want that to be marked on the W-2, you want to make sure that you mark that box here. So that's really important for employees that want that box marked. And then the other thing that's important here, we go under the setup. I'll discard. And then under payroll, Scroll down here a little bit until I get to tax ID. It's important that especially for the state, I'll just pull up Illinois as an example, that you have this tax ID number on here. So that would also print as well. So we want to make sure that under federal, that you have this tax ID number for your W-2s. And that's a window that just gets overlooked sometimes. Another just setting that's recommended to check would be for your benefits, especially for your 401k benefits, to make sure that you have the appropriate box number and label assigned to that deduction. So I'm going to go to the setup menu here. And just as an example here, I'm going to go to the deduction setup window, and I'm going to pull 401k. And you'll notice that we have this box. So in this case, actually, it should normally be 12. I don't know why it's 13 in a sample company, but it's a good example to look at here. So you could update this, and it's recommended to definitely check this so that it shows up in the proper box and label on your W-2 when you go to print those later on. I'm going to actually change mine to 12 here just to demonstrate that. And I'll save it. And then it's going to ask me if I'll roll down my changes to all records or just active. So I'll pick all. And now if I go under cards, employee deduction, I'll see that got updated for all my employees. So now they have the correct box and label assigned to their 401k deduction. So those are just some miscellaneous areas that you'll want to look at here. And then the other thing just to keep in mind later on when we get to this task, but if you're using human resources and your Affordable Care Act forms, you want to make sure under your employees, under human resources, employees, and then health insurance, you have this information filled out properly here. So here's an employee that's on a benefit insurance too, and this benefit does have the Affordable Care Act information filled in. So you'll want to make sure that you have all this updated and filled in, because this is where it's going to grab that data to print on your form. So it's recommended that you do all of this before you actually run your year-end close process, just to make sure that everything prints properly on your forms. So you'll want to make sure that, usually it's 1A, it's the most common one, and that you have this lowest cost premium dollar amount filled in. Of course, you could do that at the setup, level as well, and it'll roll down to all the employees that are to this, this health insurance, benefit deduction code here. But it's good to make sure that you have all of that in order, before you go through and actually, try to print that form out. Okay, and then, yeah, I think those are pretty much all of the, just kind of the miscellaneous type things that you'll want to check there and make sure that those are all filled out and everything. Okay, so at this point we've completed, all of our payroll for the year and made a backup. So then what we'll want to do is, make sure that we have, if we're going to install the year, make sure that we have that. And then we would want to create the year-end. So what we would do is we would actually go to under routines payroll, closing, and we'll pick our year. So it'll be 2024. And, again, the most important thing here is just that you ran all of your payroll for the year, because when it creates this year-end wage file, it's going to capture the totals for everything that's been ran, for the year at this point. So I'm going to hit process. And then I'll here. And then we do have a note in our manual. I just want to point out that it is possible to test your W-2s before closing the year. So I just want to mention that here. As long as you don't have a payroll in process, it is possible to run through this process. So you create your year-end wage file, and then you could kind of look at your W-2s and do some test printing first, if that's something that you needed to do, if you to build the confidence that your W-2s will print correctly. And if you do that, you just need to make sure then that you go, after you've tested your W-2s, that you go back to under payroll and you move your year-end information, and you could actually remove that file, and then finish processing all your payroll for 28, and then you can run it again. So I just wanted to mention that in case anybody needs to do any testing. Otherwise, assuming that everything looks good at this point, we've ran our year-end close process. So we would make another backup, and then we'd start looking at our W-2s. So if I go to the here, I can then see that it created, I have a drop down now for 2024, and it's pulling that from the year-end wage file. So if I didn't run that year-end close process, I wouldn't even have this drop down available here. And then if I look in here, I'll see all my employees. So these are all the employees that it, updated all the amounts for 2024. And this is exactly how everything's going to print on the W-2s. So at this point, if you needed to, you could, make any edits to your W-2 information, at this point. So in here, it's showing me my wages, my federal, Social Security, all the different taxes that were withheld, and everything. So I could actually edit these fields if I needed to. It's also showing me that there was a retirement plan for this employee, and so on. So I could scroll through here and, edits until I have everything correct. Same thing with addresses and all that information. And then what I can do is I could actually print W-2s here. So I have an extra year, but I want 2024, my W-2s. And they also have this option in here that they added to, if you needed to print your W-2s for the inactive employees prior to year end. So if you have an employee that has left the company and you want to send them their W-2 early before running year end, you could also print those by changing this button here. And we'll leave regular employees on here and everything. And at this point, we're just going to run the validation report. I could show you that first. And then we have some other options down here under print. So I'll print this validation here. And this is nice because it'll go through it. It'll actually run through, and it's going to validate a lot of the data, and it'll tell you if anything jumps out as incorrect. So in this case, I have some, it's a sample data. So there's a lot, it's like invalid Social Security numbers and a couple other things that it found throughout the system. So this gives you a chance to make any corrections if anything's invalid. And you could then go back to the Edit W-2 window and make those changes, and then print the validation again. So ideally, you get to the point where you don't have any more messages on your validation report. And you can also print this alignment form next, just to make sure that everything lines up correctly. So this is just a simple one-page report, and it shows the maximum, field sizes for everything. So you can see, to make sure that nothing would get cut off. And then you can print this on one of your forms just to make sure that everything's lining up correctly. And then once you know that everything is lining up and all of your amounts are correct, then you could change this over to your W-2 forms. And you could click print here. And now you're seeing your actual W-2s. So this is what's going to actually print on your forms. And then you'll notice that we have this, checkbox here that they have a retirement plan, since we updated that for 401k. and all of those should print out correct. And at that point, you have, you know, all of your W-2s printed. And if you needed to, you know, if maybe you printed something or, you know, you found right, you could go at any time, you know, you could go back to this edit W-2 here. And maybe, I don't know, one of these amounts was incorrect as an example, you know, I could actually change this. So I can, you know, literally just change there. And then when I print my W-2s again, I'll see my updated amount on my W-2 form. So I need to change that back to normal year end. Oh, in 2024, okay. So now you'll see that 10,000 I updated up there, it got updated directly on there. So now I see the new amount on my W-2 form. So it's pretty easy to, you know, be able to make those edits as you need to. You know, as often, you know, as many changes as you need to make, you can just go in there until you get those W-2s correct. The other thing that you could do as well is you can print, you know, if you have any other print from this window, you could print those forms, like the W-3 transmittal form can also be printed from here. And then the other thing that you could print from here would be the 1095 form. So I'll just print that out as an example so you could see what that looks like. And of course, this one isn't due yet. You have, you know, a little bit more time to actually print that, but you can print that whenever you have all the information in there. Okay, so this is what this form is going to look like. And you'll see this pulled directly from that employee that I pointed out earlier that had, it's pulling directly from that window here. So you'll see the $60, 1/8, you know, for every single month. It's going based off of, you know, the effective date and when they were assigned that benefit and deduction in the system. So it's showing me that for those employees. So this is a different code, and then it's showing the amount for that employee as well. So again, that's pulling from under human resources, health insurance. We'll see there's the first one, and then there's the second one, the $50, and that's where it's grabbing all of that data. So if you do need to print a 1095C report, that's where you would print that from here. And again, make sure that if you do need to print that report, that you get the year-end update though, because there were changes made to that form. Okay, so then the other option that you have is if you did want to electronically file, you do have that option as well. So in this case, we printed the actual W-2 form. But there is under routines payroll, there's this W-2 electronic filing, which there's a couple that need to be set up here. But once you get this set up, you would need to get a user ID and everything, and you would need to register to be able to electronic file. But you do have that option in here to set that up and then to actually, you know, create that file and electronically send that W-2 file instead of printing them out. Yeah, so as far as payroll, then those are the big, you know, the big steps that you need to take, you know, to actually close the year for payroll. And then there's a couple HR, you know, options that we've mentioned as well. So the first one is just archiving the inactive employee HR information. So that's optional. That's under utilities, human resources, and then there's this archive employee. So this is where you would pick, you know, the employee, and then you could pick the different areas within HR that you'd want to archive. And the other area that you'd want to look at if you're using human resources and you're using the attendance module, then you'd want to make sure you go over to your setup area down here under human resources, and then you would go to attendance and accrual periods. And you'd want to make sure that you get all of those, set up so that they're ready to go. We would change the year, to 2019. In your case, we want to put 2019, and then pick whatever pay period you use, and make sure that there aren't any lapses of dates, and that all of, all the dates are set up correctly. So if we, as an example, we have all those dates out there. And then after that, the last thing you'd want to do, since you've printed successful W-2s and all of that is complete, you've done all of your payroll for 2018, you'd want to go to your fiscal period setup window here under setup company and then fiscal period. And you'd want to make sure that, in this case, we'll pick 2024. You'll want to make sure that you close the payroll module. So that's our last one that we have open here. So now we have all of our modules closed for 2024 in this example. And this way you accidentally make any change to the payroll module, since you've already, submitted W-2s and everything at this point. And then after we've closed all of our fiscal periods, then the next thing that we'd want to do would be install the tax tables before you process your 2019 payroll. So we'd want to, install the 2019 payroll tax update. And the way that you would do that is if you go to Dynamics GP, maintenance, and then you would go to US payroll updates, and you would say check for tax updates. And then when you do that, you'll have to enter, you need to have your company's authorization number. So make sure that you get that information, and then you enter that, and it's going to basically automatically just update your tax tables for you and get that installed. And it is important to do that before you process your pay runs, for 2019. So after it does actually update under tool setup payroll tax, this is where it's actually holding all of your tax tables. So I don't have the 2019 ones on here yet. So if I was to run 2019 payroll, I'd want to make sure I get that on there, and then it's actually going to go through. And it's going to put in, all the different tables here. So here's federal married as an example. It has the personal exemption in the tables. This is where it's actually reading all of the different tax rates and the percentages for your tax tables. So that's why it's important that you get that, installed before you run your 2019 payroll. Yeah, so at that point you have everything ready to go for 2019, and you've printed all of your W-2s and everything. The last thing that you might need to do would be if you needed to print 1099-R or 1096 transmittal forms, then you would go, we could go back to on our payroll menu here under routines. We have an edit, just like our W-2s, we have an edit and a print option. So we have, if we had any 1099-Rs, we could edit all of that in here. In my sample company, I don't have any, but you can see all the different fields that would be updated in here. And then I would print them from here as well. So it's very similar to the W-2 window. I can print a validation report. I can, print my actual forms. I can print my 1096 transmittal form. And, I can print all that information in there and get those printed out as well. And that's the, the last step to do payroll. So it's not too bad. Go through the steps and actually look at, as long as you prepare and you have your timing right and everything. and you have plenty of time to update, your W-2s and get that right. So as far as the 2019 tax table updates, we just want to mention on here, as far as the changes, they did change the FICA Social Security limit amount, and that's also, planned to be released this week as well. The state changes, they have not finalized yet. So again, make sure you don't apply this until you've completed your 2018 payroll. And then we also want to just mention, if you're using the benefits self-service module, there's a couple of different recommendations that we have on here for you to go through related to those areas. So you'll want to make sure that you create your future effective benefits, and that you set up your open enrollment period and review all of your enrollments, and then complete your final pay run for 2018. And then activate those future benefits, post-review, all the enrollments and the benefits, and then start, processing your 2019 payroll. So just to make a note on, those different, the order of those steps if you're using the benefit self-service area. And then there's other items that you may be using, so we just wanted to mention these on here. And these are all things that you want to perform. If you are using any of these areas, there's a lot of modules around payroll. So we just want to make sure we point out if you're using any of these modules, the timing. And these should be done before your 2019 pay run. So if you're using accounts and splits, or FTE manager, then you'll want to make sure that you copy your employee positions. If you're using enhanced retirement plans, you'll want to change your catch-up contribution limits. And we have all that information laid out here for you on what those are, all those changes for 2019. And then you'll want to make sure you review your shared maximums to make sure that those are correct. And then for life insurance, as of right now, there's no changes, but you'll want to, it's recommended to verify those IRS rates just to make sure that you have all of those in there. And then as far as the ACA, I know we went through an example of printing out that form, but we just want to mention just kind of a checklist to make sure that you've captured everything that you need to do to be able to print those forms correctly. So you'll want to make sure, as far as for next year, that you've determined all the ALE status for 2019 for all of your employees and updated those if necessary in the system. And then, measure the part-time employees for any eligibility there, and notify them of any coverage eligible employees. And then as we went through in our example here, make sure you generate your 1095-C forms for the 2018 employees. And then the 1094-C form, if any of those are applicable for you. And then just make sure that you get that mailed out by March 4th. And then if you are interested in e-filing that, let us know, because there are a couple companies that offer that. And if you were to e-file it, then you would have until April 1st. Okay, so just want to point out some helpful documents that we have out here. So we have, we have the different year-end close information, and we have a link on where to get that. And then there's, as far as the year-end update, there's a PDF that comes along with that too. So it'll give you some more information related to the year-end update if you're interested in that. And then we have some helpful links here if you did need any tax forms, or if you wanted to look into any of the, the different IRS changes. We have a link to that here. If you did want to go through the electronic filing process for your W-2s, we have a link on where you could do that as well. So if you do, if you do want to actually create an electronic W-2 file, you have to register for a personal identification number with the Social Security Administration. And then once you've, gotten that PIN, then you can use it, to run through the setup window that we have in GP to be able to electronically file that W-2. And so you could do that as well. And then we also have some links on here for just the electronic file verification. And then here's a link if you want to look at just the year-end closing process that we just went through with some of just for payroll. So that's that last link right here. Okay, so that's everything that we have on the payroll year-end close process. So at this point, we can open it up for any additional questions that we might have, and then we'll be done with all of the year-end close procedures.
Thanks for watching. To learn more about our products, visit www.crestwood.com. Hope to see you there soon.